By now, most of us are familiar with the way in which the media, the universities, and the establishment at large has tried for so long and has failed equally as hard to force a bunch of bullshit down our throats, from this idea of gender wokeism, that there's no difference between men and women, to this idea that there's, 72 genders that you can just fucking pull out of your ass. The idea that certain dangerous views which undermine and subvert our democracy need to be censored outright in order to preserve our free society. For 4 years during Donald Trump's presidency, we were constantly told that not only Trump, but each and every one of his supporters were the most racist, sexist, misogynistic, homophobic, ableist, am I missing something? Transphobic, fatphobic, whatever the fuck under the sun, right? We were told that each and every one of those people were guilty of that, and that Trump was the single biggest danger to the history of American democracy ever, despite the fact that the Patriot Act was signed under George W. Bush's administration, and the ramping up of surveillance on American citizens actually increased to an unprecedented degree under Obama's administration. Yes, we can indeed. But what a lot of people seem to overlook is the dimension of geopolitics. How much of what you're spoon-fed about countries like China and Russia and even North Korea come from your own investigation? You understand that when you turn on CNN, you watch the mainstream media, and when you're looking at Wikipedia at this point, you're being fed a bunch of bullshit and propaganda. But when it comes to what they're telling us about countries like Russia and countries like China, most people readily accept it at face value. Just look at websites like Reddit. And although those are heavily infiltrated by the government and the U.S. Army, Eglin Air Base being the top source of traffic at one point for the Reddit website, you can't help but notice a lot of that sentiment is actually grassroots. So many young people have such a fervent hatred of China and Russia, and have even placed themselves at the vanguard of the propaganda campaign against them, oftentimes outpacing even the mainstream media, just for the sake of feeling like they're fighting some kind of injustice or fighting some kind of tyranny, which they're misplacing onto other countries when the real injustice and real tyranny is actually at home. After all, it wasn't Russia that decided to implement one of the most severe and harsh lockdowns in the history of the COVID pandemic, devastating tens of thousands of small businesses and countless livelihoods. It wasn't China that decided to label American citizens as domestic terrorists just because they engaged in protest at Capitol Hill. It wasn't Russia which decided to initiate all of these extra legal and arguably unconstitutional raids, not only against former President Donald Trump, but against other American citizens for alleged Russia ties. It's not China's fault that our government is engaged openly in a partnership with the major tech corporations in order to work together to censor not only perceived threats to national security, but now even political opponents to the Democratic Party. What if I told you that almost everything you've ever been fed about countries like Russia and China are based in lies? What if I told you that all of these rogue states that they've presented as enemies of democracy and enemies of freedom are actually being demonized by the mainstream media to get American public support for the same global system that oppresses them? After all, you have to just think about it. Where does the power of our elites actually come from? It doesn't come from getting the most likes on the social media they themselves have created. It certainly doesn't come from just printing money out of thin air. No, it comes from having a monopoly over the world's markets and resources, which they've centralized in the form of an international banking system that's centered in Wall Street and the City of London. The real reason we're being told to hate Russia and hate China is because Russia and China are part of a new and emerging global system that many have termed multipolarity. Now, currently, we live in a unipolar world system. And in that system, the world's banks, and specifically the banks that originate in Wall Street in the city of London exercise control over the entire globe and use that control to buy out the politicians of the governments under their payroll in order to keep the populations complacent and oppressed. Wokeism is actually the tip of the iceberg. They want to keep you a slave, and they want to make sure that you're living in a pod and you're eating bugs, and they want to implement their degrowth agenda for the sole purpose of safeguarding their monopoly. Because if they allow you, the people, to prosper, their position can be threatened. The same way that they got rich and they got their fucking money could be challenged by an ordinary person like you. And Russia and China, love them or hate them, are part of a global uprising to overthrow these elites, to give other people a fighting chance at prosperity and the pursuit of happiness, who exist outside of this bubble and this fake society that they've created and which they're trying to force on us in ways that you're probably familiar with. You're probably familiar with the ways in which they're trying to now come for your children in public schools. You're probably familiar with the ways in which they're censoring all political dissent in the name of defending freedom and democracy. You're probably familiar with the way they are trying to control your very thoughts and your mind. But why I'm making this video is because something pretty unprecedented happened as of last Saturday, the 20th of August. The foremost philosopher of multipolarity, Alexander Dugin, who is being reported by the media as Putin's advisor or some kind of government official when he wasn't. He was just a philosopher and intellectual, was targeted for execution by the globalists and by the Ukrainian terrorist regime solely for having dangerous thoughts and dangerous ideas. And they ended up actually succeeding in killing his daughter, who is also an intellectual and also a philosopher. Her name was Daria Dugina. Daria was not a Russian government official, as the fat liar Vosh has recently alleged on his stream. She wasn't an enemy combatant. She wasn't involved in the Ukraine war in any capacity. She was a philosopher, an intellectual, and a journalist. She was killed, as of this Saturday, in cold blood by the Ukrainian terrorist regime. But the most shocking thing of all is the way the journalists and public intellectuals and respectable blue-checked figures of our so-called free democratic society are openly celebrating the cold-blooded murder of Daria Dugina for the sole reason that she had the wrong thoughts. So much for the free democratic West protecting itself from authoritarianism. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't want you to come under the impression that this is just some remote thing that's happening in Russia. These are intellectuals with ties that span the entire globe, including the United States. We have now set the precedent that if you're a philosopher, if you're a journalist, if you're a thinker that goes against the globalist agenda, not only can you be murdered in cold blood, but the so-called defenders of the free and open democratic society that we allegedly live in are going to celebrate your murder and call for more murders, actually. But it's the American leftists who have been especially despicable. Not only have they lauded the murder of Daria Dugina, they've openly taunted, enjoyed, and celebrated the suffering of what is a grieving father. This bestial, animalistic behavior they justify under the pretense that Daria was allegedly a fascist. The most disgusting thing about that is by calling Daria a fascist, they've already proven they don't know enough about her to justify so bestially and criminally celebrating her murder in the way they did. They haven't read any of Daria's writings. They aren't familiar with Alexander Dugin and the fourth political theory. If they were, they would know that both Dugin and his daughter have routinely condemned Nazism and fascism. But it doesn't matter to leftists because anyone who exists outside of the globalist consensus, including you, can be labeled a fascist. And if you're labeled a fascist, all is permitted against you. Murder, rape, torture. You're not human anymore, you see. All they have to do is label you that word, fascist or Nazi, and it's over. You've basically left the human race. I think the picture here is pretty clear for us all. You've got a respectable establishment of all these blue check journalists on the one hand, who have to still follow the law, at least for now. And then you've got this mob of criminal, degenerate scum that they could readily unleash on any of the enemies of the globalists as long as they wave that magic wand and call them that magic word, fascist. No trial, no due process, nothing. Anyone who gets called a fascist, not only you, but your family is marked for extermination. That is the precedent that has now been set. Meanwhile, there's already a country where this has been the norm for nearly a decade, and that country is actually Ukraine. It's a country with a corrupt, liberal establishment, not dissimilar to our own, beholden to the same globalist elites and globalist agenda, which has been employing and using actual fascists and actual neo-Nazis to terrorize the parts of its population that didn't want to submit to this unconstitutional coup that was carried out in 2014 with the backing of our own deep state. It's really putting things into perspective because these things that I'm telling you about, they're not just some remote things happening on the other side of the world. It's coming here. It's already here. And we're next. So I propose something different. Instead of allowing these scumbags to exclude us from humanity and mark us for extermination because we're thinking the wrong thoughts and thinking the wrong ways, why don't we think about the ways in which our elites and the leftist dogs that they employ have themselves departed from our shared human race? Why don't we think about the fact that we outnumber them and that they're actually a minority? I think when the people, at least of America, awaken to that fact, it's not ordinary people like me and you, and it's not philosophers who are going to be the ones that have to live in fear.